Since we have the meeting being recorded and it is shortly after 6 o'clock and a quorum is present, I will call to order the May 2nd Planning Commission meeting. And we will do our welcome and introductions, and then Nick is going to give us a tutorial on how to make our audio available to the folks on Zoom. I will just start at this end of the dais and let Stephanie introduce herself.
Stephanie Bailey, Planning Commissioner.
Paul Fontenot, Planning Commissioner.
Beck Ashby, Planning Commissioner.
Tyler McCloskey, Planning Commissioner.
Nick Bond, Community Development Director.
And Josie Rademacher, Assistant Planner.
And then looking at my Zoom screen, I see Joe Morrison, Commissioner Morris.
Joe
And-
Morrison, Planning Commissioner.
Yes, and Dave is down in the corner. Do you want to introduce yourself, Dave?
Dave Bernstein, also a commissioner.
Thank you. I think that has everyone introduced. We do that for our viewing public. And now if you would please rise and join with me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. With that, Nick, did you have information you would like to give us this morning before we get started, or this afternoon?
I just wanted to report back to the Planning Commission that we talked to the city clerk, and I think we have determined that the audio quality issues we've been having relate to how close we are to the microphone when we're talking in a public meeting. And so if anybody who's present in the room can keep the microphone about 4 to 6 inches away from their mouth, it should pick up a lot better than it had been in previous meetings. Can everyone hear me okay online when I'm speaking into the microphone?
I can hear you fine.
Perfect.
Okay, we will see. I know that I attended the meeting last month on Zoom and I had a very difficult time hearing. So we're doing everything we can to make us audible also on Zoom and on the recording. With that, we will open for public comment. If there's anyone in the audience that wanted to speak to the Planning Commission, now would be the time to do that. There is no one in council chambers, and I do not believe I see anyone on Zoom. I don't know if they would be hidden from me, I believe.
We have one member of the public attending via Zoom.
Okay, and if that person would like to give public comment to the Planning Commission, please use the raise your hand feature on Zoom and we will allow you into the meeting. Okay, we're not getting a response, so we will close the public comment process. Moving down the agenda, we would like to approve the minutes from the April 4th meeting. I will call your attention to the minutes, and there was a Scribner's error under the calling the meeting to order. It said Chair Stewart, and it should say Chair Ashby. And I made that note to Josie and she has so corrected it. But our motion today should be to approve the minutes as corrected. Is there anyone who would be making that motion, Tyler?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as corrected.
Is there a second? Thank you. Is there anyone who would be voting against the motion? I will ask the second time. Is there anyone who would be voting against the motion? Hearing none, the minutes from the April 4th meeting are approved as amended. So now we have under our business items, the first one is a public hearing on LR 23 code amendments. And Nick, I'm assuming this is you.
Yes, thank you. Before the planning commission tonight for a public hearing is a very brief ordinance amending chapter 20.24040 of the Port Orchard Municipal Code. This section deals with determining when an application for development is counter complete. And when this ordinance was originally written, it was prior to us having a digital permitting platform where you can submit permits online. And with between getting that system and also the pandemic and people getting more comfortable with submitting online, we're realizing that our practices no longer match our code because 90% of the applications coming in are digital applications. So we have amended this section to recognize some changes in processing, because when you receive something digitally, usually the payment is mailed or we have to calculate a fee sheet and payments come in after the fact. And so we are just cleaning up this chapter to match the practices that we have sort of implemented as we've adopted the online platform. So the recommendation is to hold a public hearing and then to close the public hearing, discuss the ordinance, and hopefully vote to recommend approval to the city council of the ordinance as presented. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I will open the public hearing on the LR, well, to revisions to Port Orchard Municipal Code 20.24.04 or counter completeness. Is there anyone who's wishing to make comment on the public hearing? Do we still have our public in the queue, and are they wishing to make comment on this?
No, they have not raised. No, they have not raised their hand.
Having no one in person in the council chambers and the attendee on Zoom not indicating they wish to speak, I will close the public hearing. With that, I will open it up to council for any questions or concerns, comments. Okay, I'm not,
I
ahead,
suppose
Jeff.
I was just going to say this looks like a routine amendment to allow the city to accept electronic submittals. Looks good to me.
agreed. Did you wish to make a motion to send this to the city
Yes.
council with approval or recommendation?
Yes, I think I can do that. It might take me a second because I need people to tell me the words to use. I move to recommend that the city council approve an ordinance amending Port Orchard Municipal Code 20.24.040 as presented.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. It has been moved and seconded after the public hearing that that the planning commission recommend that the city council approve an ordinance amending Port Orchard Municipal Code 20.24.040 as presented. Is there anyone who would be voting against that motion? I will ask a second time. Is there anyone who would be voting against that motion? Hearing none, the motion stands approved with unanimous consent. We have another public hearing this evening, and this is regarding our housing action plan. And again, Mr. Bond, I believe that's you.
Yes. What's going on with the audio?
I'm not sure.
Anyway. Is somebody?
I believe you unmuted yourself.
Thank you. I unmuted myself on Zoom. All right. Before the planning commission tonight for a public hearing is the city's proposed housing action plan. And before I introduce our consultants, Scott Bonjukian from Makers Architecture and Andrew Oliver from Andrew, what's the name of your firm again? I forget.
Okay, Leland Consulting Group.
Sorry, Leland Consulting Group. I've been on vacation for the last 2 weeks and I'm still catching up. The housing action plan was funded by a grant from the Department of Commerce that we received and were able to start spending July 1st of 2022. And so for the last 10 months, we've been working with our consultants to develop a housing action plan. And this housing action plan is meant to provide a number of recommendations for how the city can remove barriers to creating housing and especially affordable housing. So I'm going to hand things over to Scott Bonjukian, who's going to walk you through a presentation on the final draft that is before you this evening. And then we can have public testimony and also discussion from the Planning Commission. We have suggested that if the Planning Commission feels that changes are needed or that they need more time to consider this, we can keep the public hearing open until our June meeting, at which time you guys can hopefully close that hearing and move towards a recommendation to the City Council. We are under a deadline with the Department of Commerce. We have to complete our final deliverables by the end of June of this year in order to receive the final installment of our grant funding. And so there isn't an opportunity, at least that I'm aware of, to extend that. And ultimately, this document is not being adopted in the sense that it's part of our comprehensive plan or that it's an ordinance. It's really being accepted, and it's something that provides recommendations of which we can consider individually over the course of the next 2 years or so, either as part of the comprehensive plan or as standalone amendments. But we can go through each of these recommendations and figure out how to proceed with each of them and how to really tailor them to Port Orchard. With that, Scott, did you have something you wanted to share on your screen, or are you mostly here for questions tonight?
I would like to share just about 7 or 8 slides with a quick update on what's changed in the draft since the Planning Commission was first introduced to this last month.
Perfect. Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question while he's getting the slides up?
Sure.
The state legislature was pushing some laws about home density and R1 levels.
Yes.
I think that might impact this. Can you tell us what happened with that?
I think Scott's going to go over that, but the updated draft report that has been updated since last month includes an entire section explaining the legislation that has been approved and what the implications are for the city. So Scott, I'll let you point out exactly where that is in the report because I don't have it at my fingertips.
Yes, I think it's section 1.5, and actually my first slide here is a quick summary of that, since we do have this coincidental timing where we're wrapping up the housing action plan as the state legislature just adjourned for the year, and they passed a number of updates to state's law on the Growth Management Act, State Environmental Policy Acts, and other kind of framework legislation that affects how planning happens across Washington State. And there were probably a couple dozen more than shown here on the screen, but I just want to highlight it quickly. What was most relevant, it seemed the Port Orchard items with the star led directly to updates in the draft HAP document before you. What Commissioner Bernstein was just mentioning, House Bill 1110. This is a more commonly known as the Middle Housing Ordinance. It directs cities above certain population sizes to reduce zoning and permitting barriers to middle housing. Our early read on this is that it doesn't greatly affect Port Orchard, since you already allow, since Port Orchard's population is below a certain size threshold, and you already allow duplexes in most of your zones, which is kind of the lowest tier preemptions that are in this bill. There are some adjustments that you'll need to make to parking standards and to subdivision regulations. And also House Bill 1337 is similar in that it will require you to make some adjustments to accessory dwelling unit regulations, but nothing too out of the ordinary. I'd say Port Orchards are already pretty flexible on how it regulates accessory dwelling units. So, but we do have a section in the updated draft addressing some recommendations there. Senate Bill 5412, it's a bit of a different direction. It exempts new housing developments from environmental review if the comprehensive plan in the local jurisdiction itself went under environmental review. So this is intended to remove a lot of red tape and the streamlined development permitting. 5258 requires cities to provide short plats procedures for unit lot subdivisions. I've got a slide on that coming up. I think Andrew might be able to talk a little bit to 5258 as well, which has a separate section regarding how impact fees need to be adjusted to encourage small development of smaller housing units with sliding scales for impact fees. Bill 5491 encourages cities to allow single stairway residential buildings. Typically in the United States, buildings above a certain size have to have 2 stairwells for access into the building. This bill provides some tools and some direction to the State Building Code Council to allow cities to build larger buildings with single stairways, which is provides some flexibility for building design and more natural lights and cross ventilation buildings and things like that. 1042 simply says cities cannot use development regulations to prevent additions of housing within an existing building envelope or within the existing exterior walls of the building. So for example, if maybe you have a large 1,500 square foot apartments, the city cannot require extra parking spaces if that apartment is divided into 2 units. Or if an office building, for example, is converted to residential. And lastly, House Bill 1181 doesn't directly affect our project here, but it is a new requirement that cities' comprehensive plans include a climate change and resiliency element, starting with the current comp plan update cycle, which Portage is going through right now, and most other jurisdictions in the Puget Sound area. So this will be an interesting one to navigate. There's a lot of specific requirements for looking at greenhouse gas emissions, how many vehicle trips are within or anticipate to occur within city limits, and presumably addressing housing as an option to reduce climate change emissions can be part of those strategies. So that's a quick rundown. And maybe I'll pause there real quick if there's any questions from the commission on these. Okay. So with that, our updated recommendations. Firstly, there were a bunch of small items, but I thought just a couple of these rose to the top. I mentioned there's one of those new state laws requires cities to allow unit lot subdivisions as an option for new subdivisions. And basically what a unit lot subdivision is, it kind of applies on top of your regular procedures for a land division where you're creating residential developments. And it allows small unit lots or kind of floating lots to be drawn around your individual buildings on the lot. And this is commonly used for cottage housing and townhouses and duplexes, where you want to allow the occupants of those units to own the land underneath the building, but still have some type of HOA or a homeowner association or agreement with the other neighboring units on the site to maintain driveways and accessory buildings and landscaping and things like that. It just provides a little bit more flexibility for homeownership options, basically for these middle housing types. And so the law requires only making this an option for short plats, which is typically up to 9 units or 9 lots. Although we recommend Portage should also allow it to occur for larger developments of 10 or more units. So, and also mentioned that the draft has some links to other city codes that has examples of where these have been implemented. It's kind of been an informal tool of cities in Washington State over the past few decades, but this new state law kind of formalizes and standardizes cities offering it as an option. Andrew, do you mind touching on the development fee adjustments?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having us again. So there's been a few adjustments, as Scott mentioned, resulting from Senate Bill 5258, requiring now that impact fees for residential development have proportionally lower fees for smaller housing units. So some cities require a flat impact fee for every single housing unit, regardless of what type it is. Port Orchard already prorates your impact fees by housing unit type. So multifamily units are charged less impact fees per unit than single family units. And but there's a new method that's now required to calculate this reduction. It has to be based on one of these 3 metrics: square footage, number of bedrooms, or trips generated. So with this new law, the city will need to study whether its fee structure complies with any legislation, prorating those impact fees by one of those metrics. And there's also language in the new bill consider allowing further reductions of impact fees for affordable housing development, which could be something to consider as well.
Thanks, Andrew. I've got kind of a grab bag of other updates to briefly mention. The last draft, we had a pretty extensive section analyzing the various height limits regulations that are in the downtown area, including the downtown height overlay districts. We've removed any recommendations on that, but we kept some of our observations and considerations for future use in Appendix A, just to retain that for future reference. We had some interesting discussions kind of internally with the team about affordable housing and the grocery store incentive that's in place for downtown. And there's kind of competing priorities with view protection and things like that. We thought it might be useful information for a comprehensive plan update or other future code amendments. We removed one city-owned site that we potentially thought was surplus and could potentially be sold or developed as affordable housing. Further consideration by city staff found that it's probably not a feasible site. I can't remember I think it's the water utility sites near downtown. We've updated the minimum density recommendations and also refined what zones those are recommended in. The origin of that was state law requires cities that allow a multifamily tax exemption or MFTE program to allow a certain amount of density where that tax exemption is offered. So this provides just a little bit stronger link to existing state law. And also it's a bit of a best practice in growing cities like Port Orchard that are starting to see limited land supply and options, especially for multifamily and middle housing, where you want to guarantee that, especially when you're putting new infrastructure like roads, water, and sewer, that you're getting the most bang for your buck by making sure that nearby land is being used to the best it can. New section on recommendations to adjust significant tree standards. The tree standards vary across cities, across the Puget Sound area. Some cities regulate trees, not at all, and some regulate them very tightly. And we would say Port Orchard is kind of on the tighter end of that, based on our observation looking at when working with other cities. So our recommendations suggest looking at that, maybe offering some more flexibility and thinking longer, kind of broader about canopy coverage instead of individual trees. We have additional recommendations for the multifamily tax exemption program. We learned a couple of years ago, the state allowed properties participating in the 12-year affordable housing program where they get a tax break for offering affordable units. That can now be extended an extra 12 years or a total of 24 years. So we recommend the city adopt language in its program to allow that option. Just it seems like it's a pretty win-win opportunity to provide affordable housing for a longer term, provide more stability for those residents. But a caveat with that is that properties that do that extension at the end of the 24-year period, they have to offer relocation assistance to low-income tenants equal to some amount of the rent payments to help those folks find housing elsewhere once their subsidy dries up. And lastly, associated with that House Bill 1110, I mentioned we have some recommendations for the city to update its subdivision regulations to not allow private covenants and restrictions to restrict creation of ADUs and other middle housing types in new subdivisions, or what's commonly known as private zoning. So that's a new state law requirement, and it's just best practice to allow the city to have control over zoning powers instead of private agreements. And lastly, Section 6 has been fully fleshed out with implementation guidelines, priorities. We have a matrix in there with suggested priorities for implementing each strategy and action. Our estimate for how much time it'll take to implement those strategies from the time you start. Potential costs, just expressed kind of generally in dollar signs from low, medium to high cost, and potential methods for how each of those strategies can be effective, whether it's through ordinances or the city budget. or city staffing or other things. And again, I think I'll turn it over to Andrew here to wrap up with some new performance metrics and targets that we suggest that don't hold the city's feet to the fire, but do provide some useful baselines for the city to measure progress in housing production and affordable housing going forward from here.
Andrew, before you start that conversation, could you verify for me with the reduction in those impact fees? That does not include the enterprise funds, or does it include the enterprise funds?
I can answer that one. The impact fees are Growth Management Act or authorized, and it only includes parks, transportation, schools, and fire. And at this point, I know that our transportation impact fee is based on trips, so it would comply with the new law. The parks impact fee is close, but it distinguishes between housing type, and so there's a rate for an accessory dwelling unit. There's a rate for a duplex, a single family, a fourplex, but it is not by bedroom. So there might need to be an adjustment there. And then the school impact fee, the school is also going to have to do something with their fee structure because it's only single family, multifamily. It doesn't look at any of those other criteria.
We don't set that.
Correct. And, I will say, while this doesn't impact our water connection charges or sewer connection charges, that is something we've debated over the years, is that you pay one ERU for water and one ERU for sewer, regardless of whether you're a 1-bedroom, studio apartment or a 6-bedroom house. So that is something the city council could choose to stratify going forward, but it isn't part of this law.
Thank you. And I appreciate you taking the time to answer that. You can go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Okay, so the targets. Okay, so this matrix is something that we developed with the intention of just looking at a way to track what's going on based on the objectives of the Housing Action Plan over time. Something that could be used to benchmark progress. And we sort of distilled the objectives down to 4 sort of categories of objectives: greater housing diversity, a decrease in housing price rises, reducing barriers to housing development, and new financial tools to support the development of affordable housing. And for each of those, there's a metric, which is pretty straightforward, as you can see here. The price, vacancy rate, number of housing units that are produced. And the targets are based on either sort of comparisons with the region, particularly in the case of cost increases, to benchmark what's going on in Port Orchard against the rest of the Puget Sound region and see how you're doing compared with regional prices. And there's some targets for affordable housing units that are based on projected number of population at the lower income range that we've shown earlier in the report in the breakdown of housing units needed by income. So like Scott said, these are something that could be used in an annual or biannual report to see how new actions that you take as a result of the plan are shaping up.
All right, and that concludes our update. Last thing to mention here briefly is that depending on how the public hearing is scheduled, again, Nick mentioned we're anticipated to wrap up the project through June with Planning Commission recommendation and eventual City Council action.
Thank you. Appreciate your time this evening. And I'm sure that when we open it up for discussion, we may have more questions. With that, I will open the public hearing. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to give testimony at the public hearing for the Housing Action Plan? Is our person still in the, they're not raising their hand, and there is no one in council chambers. So with that, since there is no one desiring to give testimony, I will close the public hearing and open for discussion now with the council. I would like to do things, I don't want to say out of order, but a little different than I think we have done in the past. In that I have put together a little show and tell for my review of the Housing Action Plan. And I believe Josie's going to bring it up on the screen so we can all see it. Because I was going to say a whole bunch and I thought you might get bored. So I thought if we had pictures, it would help. Okay. So those who have computers, or you can see it on the screen. Go ahead and go to the first slide. The second slide, I guess. There we go. In my opinion, good decisions are made with good information. As it says in the beginning of in our executive summary, that this housing action plan is to inform updates to the Port Orchard Comprehensive Plan, most notably the land use and housing elements, and to guide implementation strategies such as development regulations, housing programs, and infrastructure spending priorities. That's a stated goal of the plan. And as I read the plan, as presented, the HAP appears to lack intimacy with the reality and history of what is Port Orchard. I invite the consultants, the community development staff, and the Planning Commission to reframe some of the elements of the plan from a different perspective that may have a more intimate view of what is Port Orchard. So if you would go to the next slide. The first thing that I noticed when I started reviewing it is the current draft of our plan on page 6 states that right now there are 1,598 units in some stage of permitting citywide. And a certain amount of those 2,482 are expected to be completed between 2022 and 2024. And so that I'm assuming they got right from community development. And we've listened to Nick talk about all of the permits that are going on and conversations he's been having. If you go to page 8 of the draft plan, it indicates that Kitsap County targets indicate that Port Orchard will have a demand of up to 4,804 new housing units by 2044. So I'm curious as to the relationship between those two numbers. Is the 4,804 included in the 5,100 or is it in addition? And I don't care which it is. I just didn't find it stated as such in the plan. So when I got there and I couldn't figure that out, when I was reviewing basically the introductory material, it brought up more questions for me. And so that's what I would like to share with you, starting with the demographics. If you get, I know that you cannot read my Excel spreadsheet. I know you can't do that. So I have, Josie's going to bring up the website that I got some of this information from. And if you could bring up the first one, I went into Port Orchard census tracts because the plan tells us, and I would give you the page number quickly, that on page 8, that the typical home price in Port Orchard is $468,702. And it also tells us on page 7 that Port Orchard's median household income is $71,789. Okay, and then it made conclusions from that. So this is Census Tract 92101, and this is not just Port Orchard. This goes out into Sunny Slope. It goes down to Lake Flora Road. It goes all the way down Anderson Hill to the water. So it is much larger than just Port Orchard. But the density in this census tract is in fact McCormick Woods and the Ridge and that area of development. So if you scroll down this page, Okay, you will see right there. Okay, stop there. That the median household income in that census tract is $100,417. And then if you go down, and the poverty rate in that area is 5.4%. If you go down a little further, you will, just a second. No, that's, it may be, I'm looking for where it breaks out the population. That's not it, but it shows you on this particular, stop, you're going too fast. Go back up and stop at the house value right there. Okay, stop at the house value. This particular census tract has a median household value of 458,000, which is the same one that we saw in the report. However, the median household income is different. And then if you go back, we're going to scroll up and we're going to see that you went, okay, go down slowly and I'll tell you when to stop. It's the second one, race and ethnicity. Okay, stop right. You went past it. It breaks out the population by race and ethnicity. And you can see that there. And you can see that that particular census tract is heavily white. And when I was at this chart, you can push on the one button and it shows you the data. And it's the data that I've put in the Excel spreadsheet. Okay, so that is one of the census tracts. Now, Josie, if you go back up, and if you click over to the next census tract, 922, this is 922. And 922, when you look at the picture of it there, this is your basic downtown. This goes from Highway 16 to Blackjack Creek. And it goes from Sedgwick up to the water. Okay. Now, if you scroll down here slowly, we'll stop at each one. You can see that the median income in this census tract is 56,071. And you can see that the race and ethnicity is a little bit different. Go down a little bit further. And if you read the report, and this has 17% poverty. If you go down a little bit further, and just a little bit more, unless we've gone by it and I've missed it. No, stop right there. You can see in this one, which I didn't point out in the other one, the occupancy rate in this particular census tract is 54% renters and 46% owners, where citywide it's 60 owners and 40 renters. So, and all these numbers are in the little chart I did. But if you go up now and go to census tract 923, oh, and the household value, let's get down to the household value in that one first. And the household value is 317,000. Okay. Now, if we go over to census tract 923, which is from Blackjack Creek over to like Jackson, it's quite large, and it goes up to Mile Hill, and it goes down to Sedgwick. I think it's quite large. A lot of it is, I believe it's all in our UGA, but it's not all in the city. So you have to keep that in mind. So when we scroll down this one, we can see that the income levels here are 57,595. That's the median, which overarching is about 72,000. So there's real disparities within our city is the point I'm trying to make. And if you go down further and let's just look at their household, or let's look at the value of their homes. And the value of the homes here are 288,000. Now their occupancy rent owner occupied is 63,000 or 63%, which leaves 30% of renters. So it really varies. We could go up to 925. That's the other census tract. But 925, there's very little Port Orchard. It's mostly, it's very little Port Orchard, but my house is in it. It's up kind of by the high school out in Annapolis. It goes all the way out to Waterman, goes all the way out to Baby Doll Road. And so it's going to continue this same information. I'm not saying that what we have in the report is wrong. I'm saying that if it were more granular or more, as I said, intimate to Port Orchard, it would allow our city council, when they're making suggestions and changing regulations, that this would be more useful for them. And so that's why I said I would like to see the document reframed with granular information like this rather than the overarching, because saying in the report that the average house is $458,000 doesn't reflect what our city really is. And I'm trying to get it to reflect what our city really is. If I'm making any sense, that's just what I saw. Now, if we'll continue down, we can get out of the demographic page. The other, I don't want to say issue I took, but what really caught my attention is the area that's talking about racial inequities and poverty. And if you continue, scroll down a little bit further. And when you look at this, and what they've said is most of the people with lower incomes are rentals, they're not homeowners. And the decisions we make regarding rental policies can really affect people of color. So I wanted to dive just a little bit deeper and say, who are our low income people? And that's where you'll see this screen, this graph, and the largest population in our community that lives below the poverty level are white females. You can see from these graphs and that this is more indicative of what is happening in Port Orchard. So when we're making decisions and we're trying to offer more opportunities for people of color, I think that should be extended to people of low income. And having been a single mother with 2 children, I know how hard it is. And I don't want, and there's no age mentioned at all in our report, how old these people are. You know, are we trying to house a 1-parent household with a couple of kids? Or are we trying to house a 65-year-old person because their Social Security doesn't go far enough? It really makes a difference who we're housing when we determine what type what our housing needs look like. So that's why I was wanting some of the information in this document reframed so that when our council looks at these issues, they can have a better picture of really what's happening in our community. I don't know what my next slide shows. We'll go on down. What this says is the chart they gave us shows that 88% of the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders rent, and that's a big number. Only 35% of our white households rent. So when you're using percentages, it seems like the Pacific Islanders are really being impacted when in fact there's only 200 in the city. So the percentages can skew what you're looking at. And so that's why I wanted the information, and it's open to the commission, whatever they want to do, to have it a little more granular. And I don't know what my next slide is either. Oh. This is where I get into more stuff. But as I went through it, after I kind of got out of the introductory part, they have a discussion of parks, and they don't mention McCormick Woods Park. They mention Van Zee, they mention Givens, they mention Central. They mention most of our parks, but they don't mention the McCormick Woods Park. And I'm wondering where that is. They have a discussion on corridors, but I was wondering why they didn't use our centers that are already defined in our comp plan, which we already have boundaries for. We already know what they are. And in that particular discussion of corridors, and I put it to centers, there was no mention of McCormick Woods. And I wondered why we would eliminate that large area from that discussion. I didn't find in the report, and I may have just missed it, any reference to the importance of the buildable lands report. I don't think it's out yet. Is it finished? I couldn't find, I looked for it in the county website and I couldn't see it. I didn't see that in the plan. I didn't see a reference in the plan to Kitsap Transit's long-range plans, because I believe the transit activity makes a difference on where certain things are cited. I just, and I don't know, just a reference to the plan, I think is all I need. I don't need the whole plan there, but just some reference to it. And then they talked, as they did earlier, about heights. They talk about different sizes of lots and things, which all sounds good, but there wasn't any measurable for me. And I don't know whether the measurable comes at this level or comes when the city council actually starts taking action. But if you go to the next slide, this is a picture of a 7-story apartment building over in Auburn. But you see that Haven apartment on Sydney, that's a 3-story apartment building. And the one below it is a 4-story apartment building being built by the same developer at Kent Station. So it seems to me that it would be nice, and again, this probably can all happen later, but it seems to me some of these things are relevant to this plan. And I wanted to just introduce those things. Again, because I don't want to go, I should just stop there, but the plan also alludes to neighborhoods, again, talking about people of color, that the location in neighborhood can limit your access to schools or medical or jobs or things like that. We have one school district, we have one high school. It makes no difference where you live in our city. That's your that's your choice. And most of our medical is over there. The important piece to me is that there's transportation to get people to those. The question is then, is there a transit route that can get someone from my neighborhood to the medical facilities? You know, how would they do that? That's where I think the limitations are. Anyway, with that, I will be quiet, but I do love my last slide. You have to show my last slide. Oh, this is not the one that's my favorite. Okay, I just reiterate that good decisions are made with good information. It's the next slide that's my favorite. There, it's open for discussion, but this is the wall down at you know, at the Marina Park, and you are the captain of your ship and the master of your destiny. And this document may help the city define those things. So with that, I'm going to open up the discussion of the Housing Action Plan. And Dave, you have your hand up. We will call on you first.
Commissioner Ashby, commend you on that. That was excellent and clearly thoroughly reviewed and looked over. Far more detail than I did. But so thank you very much for that. I wish it was another 5 or 6 pages long. And some of the things you said were things that were becoming apparent to me, even at a higher altitude look down at it. I gotten the feeling that this document was probably more like, how do we maximize housing action plan, rather than how does this housing action plan fit into our community and the lifestyle we have here? And I know that we're trying to make more affordable housing is one of the goals, but I think we've talked in the past about some of the difficulties with having heavily rental facilities and lower income properties and becoming heavy on those. Not to be against them per se, but those are also the residents in the city that are limited income, more transient, and more likely to be starter houses and moving on to someplace else, and are the least likely to be paying to approve school levies, EMS bonds, other things that the community actually needs to continue to stay progressive and grow and improve in quality. That's always a problem. I mean, when I was young, single, living in a community, if they wanted me to pay extra for a school bond, it was like, no, I don't got kids I do not have kids in the school system. I can't afford it. I don't want to spend the money. So it's one of those things I get a little concerned about, that we become a heavily transient, self-perpetuating, limited income community with promoting strong affordable housing. But I do think that this plan does not take into consideration a lot of the flavor of Port Orchard, which I think you're taking as an intimacy. And we have also spent months, years of work on this planning commission, coming up with many of these policies over the years, carefully crafting them to reflect our community. You mentioned, for example, the significant trees, which is actually one that I kind of pushed and spearheaded pretty strongly myself, because we had a very weak or poorly written significant tree. Yes, it is rather strict, but that was because we were, before it was written, losing much of our forested trees in the community faster than they'll ever replace. And so it was meant to be somewhat restrictive and trying to replace and maintain the natural environment here. This land is forested land. We've deforested an awful lot of it already. So yes, that was a restrictive policy, but it was kind of done that way on purpose, and that was over years of work. And I'd hate to undo a lot of decades of work with a new plan that just kind of wipes all that clean without taking into consideration why we did it to begin with.
Thank you, Paul.
Yes. Well, first, I mean, I absolutely appreciate the input of the older planning commissioners who've been here longer and seen more of it. And I certainly understand your concerns. However, I believe the plan in and of itself is generally a positive move in the right direction. And while some see that it loses the character of Port Orchard in all the analytics and things like that, I would actually say I disagree with that personally, especially with regards to just how the action plan, what its approach is. It's more or less, from my perspective anyway, a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down one, right? It mentions at the beginning that obviously the city council and the city government itself can't, force where buildings go and where buildings don't go. It can't force what is housing and what is not. It can only influence the market the way it is. So it really just depends on how you're setting up the laws to set up where people are choosing to build these houses, right? And especially considering you had mentioned the racial disparities, right? How it had mentioned that, and perhaps not taking into consideration low-income whites as well. With the chart that is mentioned on page 10, it does mention that white households are 35% renting households, while 65% of them are owning. So that does indicate that earlier on in Port Orchard's history, whether through intention or non-intention, a lot of those early houses were bought up by primarily white people, and rather than people of color. And while a lot of these in these times there were mostly with just white people and not people of color in Port Orchard to buy these houses. We've seen more and more of that start to change, indicating that maybe some situational circumstances that were prevalent in Port Orchard in years past are no longer the case, allowing people of different races and ethnicities to move in and buy houses and things like that. It's pretty clear that through several studies have been done that one of the main ways that a family can create generational wealth, indicating, you know, obviously wealth is passed on through generation to generation, is through land ownership and home ownership, right? And that opportunity hasn't been forwarded to, I think, to a lot of people. What this does, and of course, one might point out, well, it's obviously a lot of housing that's renting housing that's been built rather than home ownership. It allows people, I think, with especially low-income housing, to save more of their paycheck, you know, to whether, you know, when they have more low-income jobs, to save more of their paycheck to be able to save up to buy those houses, right? So if we're coming up from a top-down approach saying, well, we should build more houses and, you know, single-family detached housing and that sort of housing that has been presented thus far, it's basically saying, okay, well, we'll build you more houses that you can buy, regardless of whether or not you have the money to buy it. So who's going to end up buying those houses? Well, it's going to be the people who have the means to do so, right? Whether if you build houses, you build housing that is rented housing, especially subsidized housing, low-income housing, it allows people who may be on the poorer side, more low-income side, to be able to save up that money, to be able to keep more of their paycheck, and over time to be able to maybe put down a down payment and a mortgage on a house, right? And so it's building that foundation from the ground up. And I think that it's an important inclusion to include the racial disparities as an identifier of the realities of the situation. Of, you know, in the end, or in the beginning, there was a reason why the vast majority of the population of Port Orchard was white versus other races. You know, it's I think a little bit of a correction in that circumstance, and I think it's a course correction in that circumstance. I just think that just generally having the bottom up approach and focusing on people who maybe need that extra help and allowing them to get to the point when they're able to put a down payment down on a house and be able to pass down generational wealth is more important than presenting immediate, you know, housing or home ownership needs to people who already have those means. So.
Is there anyone else? Do we have more
I will-
discussion? Thank you, Joe. Go ahead.
I will take a moment, say that I think the thoughtful note about poverty, and yes, noting historical differences that continue to this day in wealth creation between persons of color and white people, I think it's appropriate for the report. I will also say that I actually had a question for the consultants. So you listed homelessness as a medium priority, and I'm just interested in what drives your priorities and why did you flag it as medium?
Thanks, Commissioner Morrison. Good question. Let's see if I can pull that up here. So you're referring to strategy 3.2 in the implementation matrix. I think we flagged that. Obviously, homelessness is a high and immediate priority for the person being impacted and just trying to live on the street day to day. But we flagged it as medium because it's not quite in the city's wheelhouse. Doesn't really have the staffing or the resources to address it directly. In talking to staff, it seems that there's other social service agencies, and Kitsap County are the ones kind of more directly trying to get people indoors as quickly as possible. But we didn't put it as a low because also the city can still help by treating homelessness as an emergency and just building more housing in general to try to at all income levels to try to get folks at different income levels inside.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure, as a resident of Port Orchard, that it is a medium priority for me. It might be a high priority for me as a resident of the city. I'm not sure yet, and I'll take more time to review the report as in the interim between our next meeting. But I think it's an emerging issue that is affecting our city, and I'm interested in solutions. So just a note, I was excited to see the tax increment financing recommendations in your housing action plan. And in general, I think the housing action plan's purpose is to help, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Nick. The housing action plan's purpose is to help increase the potential supply of housing in our community and thereby decrease the costs, generally speaking, to people seeking to be housed. It was interesting, and by the way, Commissioner Ashby, I already think so highly of you. You get 10 million gold stars. One thing that's interesting about that census data is there are those median home values we don't see them on the market right now. And so homes really are close to, homes are kind of close to $500,000 in Port Orchard, regardless of your census tract, as far as I can tell. There might be exceptions, there might be condos, but the vast majority seem to be 400 and up. So those are my comments. I've made a lot. I thank all the commissioners for their feedback and their thoughtfulness. It's a great group to work with. Thank you.
Yes, Andrew?
Hi, thanks everyone. Thank you for everyone's thoughts and careful research and review of the plan. I wonder if I just wanted to mention a couple of things about data, not to dwell on this at great length. But just because some things didn't make it into the HAP executive summary section on the data, but are contained in the existing conditions report, which will eventually be in the same document as an appendix, but currently is a separate document which you've seen several months ago. There's a lot of data in there which breaks down incomes and housing prices in some similar ways, particularly by income bracket, to show the wide range of incomes of residents in Port Orchard, and also if I could just share this for 1 second. So I just wanted to point out a few things here to review, if you wish, that are related to the data that you shared as well. Here in the existing conditions report, which I believe everybody has. So the housing income and cost are broken down here by ownership and rental households in the first chapter, and as well as the income of Port Orchard residents broken down by a bunch of different brackets. And then we also have some data on cost burden later on, which refers to what percentage of people's income they're spending on housing. So I just wanted to point out that it's not exactly the same way spatially that you broke it down, and it is really important to look at different neighborhoods and understand what's going on across the city. But I think that the way that we broke it down by income levels can also give a picture of how many people across the city in different parts of the city are earning different incomes. And with just one other thing to note, I just wanted to sort of explain perhaps the reason, the disparity for those two numbers that you noticed at the beginning, which are indeed very different. The housing permit data refers to how many houses obviously have pulled permits. Not all of those would necessarily are expected to all be built, but it demonstrates the sort of large amount of developer interest in building housing in Port Orchard, not only in places like McCormick Woods, which we already know has been happening for a long time, but elsewhere in the city as well. And whereas the housing target is not a number that's necessarily based on exactly what's happening, but that's what comes from the county down to the city for how many housing units you need to accommodate over the next 22 years. So the fact that the number of permits is larger than the number than the target from Kitsap County really reflects the high demand for housing in Port Orchard that we're seeing, and it really demonstrates that perhaps there's a possibility of even surpassing the target set by the county. So I just wanted to mention the relationship between those two numbers because it is confusing, but they come from different places and they have different
But
implications.
you did clarify for me, they're showing the same thing. The 4,400 is not in addition to we're not looking
Correct.
to get 9,000
Correct.
units.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Nick, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was actually going to speak to the numbers that you mentioned in your presentation, and I'll go ahead and speak to that first. The 5,000, which page is it on? 5,198 units includes all of the entitled McCormick Woods development. And so when we say are currently in permitting, that includes McCormick Woods, which has been permitted as a subdivision and has a 20-year development agreement in place. And so that is within the 20-year planning horizon for our 2024 through 2044 comp plan update. But that is really what is pushing us over the growth target that has been set in the countywide planning policies. I think the language could easily be cleaned up here just to make it clear that it is not, in fact, 9,000 people that are homes that we're planning for. So that was my first point. The parks comment that was made about McCormick Village Park, obviously we adopted the McCormick sub-area plan, and the McCormick Center is right next to McCormick Village Park. And while I wouldn't propose changing the zoning because we've just put that in place, we could mention that that is a parks-oriented development. And I was going to point out there's actually one unentitled piece of property that is really close to McCormick Woods. It's about 30 acres. That maybe one of the recommendations in the report should be that is upzoned. If you wanted to include McCormick Park as part of this conversation, I would say look at upzoning the one unentitled piece of property and then just mention that it is a parks oriented development area.
Thank you. I just have to say what's on my mind. And that is, we have all this development at McCormick Woods. And if we ever get a new high school, who knows if that will happen. But that's the area it's going to be in. And that's when you're going to start seeing disparity between the availability for education and things like that. And my personal feeling, because I live in a very eclectic neighborhood, okay? And you do not see on my street, on the same side I am, there are 3 fourplexes and then at least two single-family residents that rent as 2 units. And then down the street, and then across the street is an apartment building, 2 apartment buildings. You don't even see them in our neighborhood. They don't show up. They're just part of the neighborhood. And it seems to me that McCormick Woods should not be immune from those types of developments. And I know that they've done a great job with their new section that they're just developing with a variety of housing types. But it seems to me that being out there would be a great place to put maybe a neighborhood of duplexes where families can rent or live. I would like to see our city more homogeneous, is what I'm saying, is more homogeneous and not have the disparities that we do. Anyway, that's what I'm saying. So go ahead.
Yeah, and on that note, I'm actually, what you just said reminded me there's a second unencumbered or unentitled piece of property in the old part of McCormick Woods where they came in and wanted to do like 30 townhomes 10 years ago. And I believe we started discussing that with the Planning Commission, and it was rejected at that time. And so I think that's called Parcel B. There's also the larger 30-acre parcel is right at the southwest corner of the roundabout that connects McCormick Village to McCormick West. And that's, that seems like an ideal spot to put some other housing types within the McCormick area. And then finally, one of the things that we've been talking about internally is part of the 2024 comprehensive plan update is that McCormick East off of Glenwood, where you go into the backside of McCormick Woods, there's about 120 acres there. Some of it has some critical area challenges, but it's pretty developable area. And we've tentatively indicated that we would like to mark that as kind of a future center that has mixed housing and commercial development. And so that's the other area that potentially brings those types of those housing types into the McCormick area. But I would suggest as part of this park oriented development, you also talk about, I mean, it talks about zoning changes near Givens, and Van Zee probably makes less sense than Givens because of the topography and it's just not as walkable an area. But if we're going to propose zoning changes around Givens, we should probably also be proposing those in the vicinity of McCormick where those unentitled pieces of property remain.
I go back to my original statement is that I didn't quarrel with necessarily what the report was. It just didn't reflect to me the Port Orchard I've lived in for this many years. And that's what I was trying to get across. So Stephanie, do you have any comments?
I do not, other than I appreciated what you're sharing your thoughts in your presentation, very much so.
And Tyler?
I don't. I really liked the granular data points though. As an analyst, I love data. So
Okay, so what the Planning Commission, we can either accept this plan as it is and move it forward to the city council, or we can ask them to make some refinements in it and bring it back for another public hearing in June. We only got the report, this draft, last week. I don't know if that was enough time for the Planning Commission to thoroughly digest it. I also know that we do have a time issue, meaning that it has to be executed by the end of June. So if there's any changes at all that we would like, or modification edits to it that we would like, this is the opportunity we have to let the consultants know that. And so my question is, I know the recommendation had been to continue our public hearing till June. So, what is the council's pleasure?
And Planning Commission, but in terms of continuing it, you've already closed the public hearing. I believe you can actually reopen it and then make a motion to continue the hearing so that we don't have to re-advertise.
Okay.
If you want it to be re-advertised, we certainly can, but given the lack
No,
of interest tonight.
I just meant the public comment part was done, and so I did that incorrectly, and I apologize.
No, that's all right.
I think that generally the whole outline of the housing action plan in and of itself is pretty sufficient. In terms of the remark you made on granularity, well, certainly there's always going to be more data that can be collected, especially considering the different neighborhoods. One of the things I've known about Port Orchard my entire life is how diverse it is, both socioeconomically and racially. I think that's too much granularity can kind of destroy more or less the general, I wouldn't want to say narrative, but it's the word that's coming to mind right now, of the housing action plan in general, just being that focusing on more density, focusing on addressing communities that have not been addressed in days past, not only racially, but also socioeconomically. So the poor white population that hasn't received as much attention in the past. Generally, I think that the housing action plan does address those quite well.
So am I hearing you to say that you would recommend us sending it to council the way it is?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Is there anyone else who wishes to give input on that?
I don't want to send it to council tonight for certain. I would like more time with it. And there were a number of points that you made that I actually would like to see included. A little more of the granularity as you described.
Scott?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was just going to respond in general that in terms of granularity of data, I appreciate the feedback that the neighborhoods differ. Fortunately, Port Orchard has Andrew and I and a large consultant team also working on the Port Orchard comprehensive plan. So I think at the minimum, that's a larger effort with more funding and more time. And we're currently actually doing the existing conditions analysis for that right now. So I think we'll definitely take the feedback to that larger team and we make sure we're looking at things at a neighborhood level or a census tract level. So that'll happen at a minimum. And I can say, even if you do make a recommendation as the plan as is, so to say, at the council tonight, we can certainly still incorporate feedback. It's not, the document doesn't have to be 100% unchanged when it goes to council. I think we heard some good feedback tonight from all commissioners that we can incorporate regardless of the timing.
Thank you, Dave.
I think I'd like to see those changes first, though, myself, before sending it on. I also wonder if perhaps percentages, as you pointed out, can be somewhat misleading, especially in the example you gave. I'm wondering if putting those numbers as a per capita might be more illustrative. Also, perhaps on those percentages of housing and housing types and sizes, same thing of how many houses. I'm not sure if percentage works well or not, but I think the per capita on the population data might be more helpful than percentages.
So I do want to point out that we are out of budget on our consultant time. So we're somewhat limited in what we can do under the scope here. But I think that making the changes, clarifying the introduction on population is an easy change to make. I think if we want to do something with parks, that's a pretty easy change to make. I'm wondering, Andrew, if we wanted to update the tables just so that it displays both a percentage and a numerical value. That seems like a really easy thing to toggle on and off with our graphics. I don't know if you're actually looking for other data beyond what's in the initial conditions report that was provided, but those seem like the three big things that I heard that we would like to have updated in a final draft that would come back to the Planning Commission in June. Is that recapping things accurately?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Oh, no, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. Oh, I was just going to say, Nick, yes, certainly displaying, numbers and percentages is easy, as you said. Another thing that comes to mind in the context of this discussion is that there may be a few other data points, as I mentioned, that are living currently in the existing conditions appendix section, which may be beneficial to bring forward, not a huge amount more data, but maybe a couple of other points just to help clarify some things about income distribution and such in the executive summary of the housing needs assessment, which is the first chapter in here. So I think another thing that might that we could do to help set the stage with the data a little more thoroughly within the housing action plan itself could be to bring a couple of other charts and data points and include those in the earlier chapter.
And one final, unmuted the wrong thing. One final discussion. I know Commissioner Bernstein, you mentioned the tree canopy issue, and this has obviously been something that we've worked on before and haven't really been able to resolve. I will say that I was very sensitive with our discussion of view protection overlay and made our consultants rephrase how they worded that to say that this is a trade-off between affordability and views. And so maybe if the whole Planning Commission wants the language change regarding tree canopy, we could probably rephrase that to say that, the council should consider the trade-offs between preservation of existing trees versus housing affordability, and understanding that is a give and take, rather than, I think right now it's more of just an outright recommendation that we go in a particular direction. So I didn't hear any other planning commissioners aside from Commissioner Bernstein mention that. So maybe discuss that. And if that's something you want to do, we can tweak that language.
My input on basically their recommendations is I didn't spend as much time looking at them. Some of them were almost humorous to me. One of them suggests that we inventory our motels because they could possibly be converted into housing for homeless people or transitional. And well, there are 3. I've already inventoried it for you. There are 3. So there are some things like that just, I'm going, this, you have to look at what Port Orchard is. But I did not think when I did my presentation, offered input on the actual recommendations. I was just trying to highlight the data that the council will use to implement or make decisions on those recommendations. And that was what you can't make a good decision if you don't have clear information on the front side. That was the point I was trying to make. So is there what I have heard from Nick is that there is not a lot of revenue to do a major or a lot of changes to this. But Nick has identified some that were talked about tonight. Andrew indicated there was some additional data in the needs assessment, and I thought that was an excellent document, or I enjoyed the document when I read it, that could be brought over. And it sounds to me like that would not necessarily be cost prohibitive for us to do. And I heard from Commissioner Bernstein that he would like the document to come back before that we recommended it. So at this point, I would entertain a motion to keep this hearing open until June and make that recommendation, or I would be open to a recommendation to move it, the housing action plan along the way it is. So we're open to either recommendation.
I would like to recommend we keep the hearing open until June.
Is there a second to that?
I'll second that.
Thank you. So it has been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion on the motion that this be moved to?
I was just going to say it just from a procedural standpoint. I think the motion needs to be to reopen the hearing and then to continue it until June because the hearing was already closed.
Okay. Okay. It has been moved and seconded, I'm sure, by the motion maker and the second, that the motion is to reopen the hearing at this time. So we will reopen the hearing and then we will continue it to June. It will be two separate actions. So with the consent of the motion maker and the second, do you agree with that? So that the motion on the floor is to reopen the public hearing on the housing action plan?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the motion on the floor is to reopen the public hearing for the housing action plan. Is there anyone who would be voting against that motion? I will ask a second time. Is there anyone who would be voting against that motion? Hearing none, the motion passes with unanimous consent. So now we will need a motion to continue the public hearing to our June meeting.
I would make a motion to continue the hearing to our June meeting.
Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Second.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? The motion on the floor is to continue the public hearing on the housing action plan until June. Is there anyone who would be voting against that motion? I will ask a second time. Is there anyone who would be voting against that motion? Hearing none, the motion passes with unanimous consent, and we will have this on our agenda in June. Thank you. And I do appreciate Scott and Andrew, you guys joining us this evening. These are important documents we're putting together. And we also appreciate the work you're doing on the comprehensive plan. We know how I don't want to say strenuous, but the effort that it goes in to do that work. So we appreciate you a great deal, and we thank you for giving up an hour and a half of your evening to join us. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so far. We look forward to wrapping up next month. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. We'll see you then.
Moving down our agenda, we have a discussion on amending chapter 2.20 of the comprehensive, for the Planning Commission section of the comprehensive plan. Josie, is this you?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Josie Rademacher, Assistant Planner for the City of Port Orchard. In tonight's packet, staff provided a redline version of Port Orchard Municipal Code, or POMC 2.20 Planning Commission outlining the proposed changes and additions for the code for your review and discussion. City staff were made aware of a lack of regulations and guidance for the Planning Commission's activities and that some regulations would be helpful for the commission in carrying out their duties. While Port Orchard Municipal Code 2.20 provides some direction to the commission, staff were directed to draft regulations that reflected the preferred examples discussed at the last meeting and to move forward with amending the code. To Dave's comment from the previous meeting, when an ordinance is adopted and added to the website for the municipal code, there is a date and when that ordinance was adopted at the bottom of the web page. That wouldn't be seen in the attachments that are given because they are Word documents for your review. But know that once an ordinance is passed, there is a date of when it was passed available on the website. Furthermore, the Planning Commission should review the proposed revisions to POMC 2.20 prior to scheduling a public hearing. Should the commission choose to move forward with the proposed changes, staff recommends that a public hearing be scheduled for the next Planning Commission meeting on June 6th. And Beck, I will turn it over to you for discussion. Thank you.
Did everyone have an opportunity to read this? Okay. I will highlight kind of what was put in here. One was the conduct of the 2.20.025. It reiterates that or spells out that our meetings are consistent with the Public Meetings Act and the Public Records Request Act. It highlights that we will use Robert's Rules of Order newly revised in how we organize and administer our meetings. It indicates that we will have a physical location for our for any public, but that we will also allow remote access for verbal communications, and that we will consider that a quorum is required for passage of any matters before the commission. To me, the big things here that were before, that had not been in the other, that we're adding to, is to specify that remote attendance is okay, because it was not specified before. And I thought that it was important that we know that people attending remotely are the same as being here and that they count towards our quorum. I also thought it was very important that we make sure everyone's aware that we operate under the Open Public Meetings Act and the Public Records Act. So with that, is there any discussion on this? Seeing none, is it the wish of the commission to move this forward and have a public hearing in June so that it can go to council? Mr. Morrison, were you making that motion?
I'm happy to make that motion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, I need professional help when it comes to making motions, so give me just a moment as I page back to the recommended motion. Oh, wow. Is there a recommendation? I would like to motion that we hold a public hearing for June 6, 2023 on the proposed amendment for
Thank you.
POMC 2.20, the Planning Commission Rules and Regulations.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you. It has been moved and seconded that the revisions to Chapter 2.20 Planning Commission have a public hearing at our June, I think it's 6th meeting. Is there anyone who would be voting against that motion? I will ask a second time. Is there anyone who would be voting against that motion? Hearing none, the motion passes with unanimous consent. Now, I see the last item. This is a long meeting for us. the last item is a report from Mr. Bond.
Yes, the one item on my report for tonight, in addition to the previously announced training opportunity with PSRC, which nobody has indicated so far that they intend to participate in, but you're still welcome to sign up. There is a Southwest Washington Planners Forum that is open to elected officials, planning commissioners, and planning staff that is being held, and Josie's going to be sending out the information for that tomorrow if she hasn't already. I don't recall the date of it off the top of my head, but I believe it's coming up in May 11th, so next week. So if anyone is
Is that a
interested,
Zoom meeting also?
I believe so.
so anyway, that's the extent of my report this evening. Well, I will share some additional information because it came up in the housing action plan tonight. I did want to share with everyone that the McCormick Village project, where the commercial area is at McCormick, as well as the first phase of the mixed housing subdivision, are both in for permitting right now, and the commercial piece is pretty close to being in a final form. I think they're working on a couple last revisions with Public Works, but it's really exciting. I think it's a project that, you know, is doing some pretty innovative things, and it's the type of project where I feel like that you can be nominated for awards for doing really good design, and I'm just excited for Port Orchard to see that going forward. So that's really exciting. The other big thing, we had 2 RCO grants. That's the Recreation Conservation Office. One of them, we're going to be, it looks like the state legislature passed the budget. Our Givens Park Sport Court remodel project was there, and that's the young man who came and presented his petition about 1.5 years or 2 years ago. We're doing a sport court. The basketball court will become a futsal combined basketball court, and the tennis courts will be refurbished for tennis and pickleball, so that we'll have additional pickleball facilities in the city. So I think we're going to do that design. I think we will probably have to hire a consultant, but it's going to be a pretty fast project in terms of how long it takes to design, and hopefully we can build that in the summer of 2024. The other project we got was an additional $500,000 for the Community Event Center, where we're going to remove the old seawall, do some environmental enhancement, along with a new overwater structure that will give people access to the water. And so that's an exciting one, and we're pretty far along with Kitsap Bank on their project. We're hoping we'll have something to share with the public probably in June, but we're still trying to figure out the meeting date where we'll do a council presentation on their piece of the project. So lots of exciting things happening in DCD.
Yes, thank you. And I do appreciate Josie and Nick bearing with me while I did my presentation tonight. Thank you. Is there anything else? Is there anything that any of the commissioners wish to share? Hearing none, we will adjourn, and we will see everyone in June. Thank you.